Hello everyone. The talk you're sitting in on right now is Cipherspaces and Darknets, an overview of attack strategies. First of all, quickly a little bit about me. I run IronGeek.com. Hopefully some of you have visited the website before. I have an interest in InfoSec education. I don't know everything, I'm just a geek with time in my hands. So if I get something slightly wrong on one of these darknets I'll be talking about, come up to me after the talk, I'd be interested in hearing about it. Back in the Q&A room. I'm also an irregular on the ISD podcast. They podcast 5 times a week. I'm usually on Thursdays. And I'm also a researcher for the Tenacity Institute, which was kind enough to sponsor me coming here today. All right, a little bit of background information. First of all, what do I mean when I say a darknet? Now, there's a lot of different definitions, and it can get a little confusing. There's some name collision out there. But I'm using the broader sense of darknet to be just an anonymizing network. Generally speaking, these darknets are also known as mixed nets, where you have multiple proxies that you hop through and different levels of encryption so that you can communicate and people don't know both where you're communicating to or what you're communicating. I also love the term cypherspace, and that might be a little clearer term to use for some of these networks. The two ones I'll be using as reference examples are, of course, Tor and I2P, but there's a lot of other ones, and some of the attack strategies I'll be talking about here are very academic, and there's actually mitigations in place in both Tor and I2P to hopefully make them not be nearly the size of the problem that they could be. Things get subtle when you're talking about attacking mixed nets. Terms kind of vary between researcher and researcher, what they mean, some particular term means. For instance, who here has ever heard of a Sybil attack? Who here has ever heard of a sock puppet? Probably a few more people sock puppet. I'll go into the definitions of all those, but a lot of literature out there is very academically oriented, and I'm going to try to make this talk be geared in such a way that it helps people understand that academic research without necessarily having to have read 20 papers on the subject. There's a lot of weaknesses that are interrelated. Sybil attacks, for instance, can be used to help augment attacks with like traffic correlation. And like I said, there's a lot of other cypherspaces out there besides Tor and I2P. The ones you see up there on the screen, it's just to name a few. But Tor seems to have gotten most of the ground, and I2P is sort of a runner-up. If anybody wants stickers from the I2P project, come up to me at the Q&A room. I have some. But like I said before, I'm going to focus on Tor and I2P for my illustrations. And some of the attacks will be very academic, and I'm going to try to give a few real-world examples, though, to illustrate how they can be used. Now, when it comes to attacking darknets, threat model matters a whole lot. You can't really protect against everything. Some protocols may just be lost causes. One of the problems with some of these cypherspaces is that people try to throw protocols across them that just were never designed to be anonymized. BitTorrent would be a good example, which I'll go into a little bit later on. Users may do things to reveal themselves. No matter how anonymous someone is, if they start using a darknet and use their real name, well, you know who they are. Not all the attacks that we're talking about necessarily reveal the actual identity of the person. They may just reveal the IP address they're truly talking from, or it may just reduce the anonymity set. For instance, you don't know the true IP they're from, but you know they used ISP X or they're in country Y. Also, when it comes to attackers, there's different types. You have your active versus passive ones. Your active ones are actively doing stuff to manipulate the network, and passive ones are just sitting there listening. You also have location, internal versus external. Externally listening, like your ISP might be. Internally, somebody who decides to join the darknet and screw around with other peers to see what they can find out. Adversaries, of course, also vary by their power level. You have like nation states, which have a certain higher level of power. You're going to have things like ISPs as well. Then there's differences between Western democracies and other places. For instance, some of these darknets, they may do a very good job of hiding who you're talking to and what you're sending. Everybody knows you're using it. And in some countries, just the fact that you're trying to hide something from the government may be enough to have someone come knock at your door. Also, some private interest groups may also be interested in figuring out who's actually behind a certain pseudonym or who's actually exchanging information in these darknets. And finally, those schmucks like me who just like to play around. All right, The two darknets I'm going to use for most of my illustrations are both Tor and I2P. I'm only going to quickly cover those. How many people here have heard of Tor before? Pretty much everybody. How many people have heard of I2P? Oh, that's more than cool. Awesome. But Tor, essentially, you have multiple levels of encryption. You pass something in. It's like Chinese nesting dolls or like an ogre with layers. And each layer along the way gets stripped off until you get to the exit point. Then you reverse the process to get back in. Hidden services are a slightly different issue where you can host something inside the Tor network. But it's mainly focused on outproxying to the public internet. I2P, on the other hand, a little bit different. Instead of using bidirectional tunnels where you build a circuit and it's both your in and your out, it has unidirectional tunnels where basically you have a series of out tunnels. You send something out and you send them into someone else's in tunnels. And you have in tunnels of your own, which information is coming to you from other people's out tunnels. This unidirectionality is there to hopefully mitigate some traffic analysis attacks because you have to compromise more nodes in the network to figure out who's talking to who. It also uses layered encryption. It generally refers to it as garlic routing, and I'll try to discuss the difference. Garlic packets, and I'll try to explain some of the definitional differences between the two. But its key focus isn't outproxying to the public internet. It can do that, but generally you have like one out proxy. Its main goal is so you can host something internally without other people knowing you're the one hosting it. And this could be anything from, well, an EAP site, which is a website, to a box you can SSH into, IRC, all those sorts of things. And in my opinion, this is rather subjective, it seems to do the hidden services types of functionality faster than Tor does. But it doesn't really have great outproxying ability to the public internet because you generally have one out proxy, so it's easy to detect. Not that Tor can't be detected, but that's another subject matter. Essentially, you have, with I2P, 3 levels of encryption. You have your end-to-end, you have between each hop, and you have between your in-tunnel and your out-tunnel. Conceptually, though, it's pretty similar to onion routing. The key difference is it's called garlic because you have cloves in a piece of garlic, to where in theory you could make a message, send it to an endpoint, actually have it separate out and have it separate out into separate messages, and have them all return to you in different ways. Now, the way I2P currently implements this, it doesn't really take that full functionality. It's actually a little closer to onion routing than that picture illustrates. But that's a concept of what you could potentially do with garlic routing. And if you accentuate that some more, imagine if you can send a message out and have cloves of it separate here, separate there, come back in different directions. And they're asking us masking traffic for each other as you're sending these packets out on the network. It's not exactly that implemented that way in I2P as of yet, but the packet format has that potential. All right, the first vulnerabilities we're going to be talking about are untrusted exit nodes. You're only as anonymous as the data you send. Quick overview, this is mostly Tor-centric. You got to wonder, is the person who's running the exit point you're going through, are they looking at your data? The traffic may be encrypted while it's inside the network, but once it hits that exit point, it's unencrypted, or it's encrypted as whatever protocol is riding inside of Tor. If you're using HTTPS, you may be okay, depending, and I'll get up to that depending here in a second. A few instances, Dan Egerstad, the whole thing, embassy hack, as it was called back in 2007. Essentially, a bunch of people were workers at embassies were using Tor to tunnel out of the host country so they could do things anonymously. Unfortunately, the things they were doing didn't lend themselves to being particularly anonymous. Yeah, the host country may not have been able to directly spy on the communications, but when you're using POP3, SMTP, HTTP basic authentication, and other plaintext protocols, the person who's sitting there on that exit point can sniff it. What Dan did was he set up his own exit point and started sniffing the traffic to see what was going on out there. Not exactly the best way to keep yourself private if you're using Tor for those sorts of functionalities. So keep in mind, if you're using Tor, be careful what you send out there. You're only as anonymous as the data you request and send. Also, Moxie Mullenspike had a similar thing, and this is where my little note about SSL comes in. He set up his own exit point, and he put SSL strip on it. So even if someone was trying to use HTTPS and have it extra encrypted inside the Tor tunnel, he'd use SSL strip, knock that connection down to HTTP, and be able to look at it. And if the person who was surfing using Tor wasn't paying attention and didn't notice that the lock wasn't there or the URL didn't say HTTPS, then they might very well have been owned. Quick illustration of what this looks like, and also gives you a better idea of what I mean by onion routing. Essentially, you have 3 layers of encryption on a message. One layer gets stripped off on each hop, hits the exit point, goes out unencrypted, and at that point, the person can look at it and possibly modify it to do some other attacks I'll be talking about later on. You can tell, some people when they draw node diagrams of cipherspaces and mixed nets, they give you like circles and lines. So this is my interpretation of what a darknet should look like. It's all one big happy darknet. And of course, anytime you see someone with a goatee, we obviously know the goatee one's evil. Okay, keep in mind, mitigation-wise, Tor is for anonymity, not necessarily security, but only as secure as the protocols you're trying to make right on top of it. Use end-to-end encryption. Don't use plain text protocols, and if you do use plain text protocols, expect that other people might be able to see them. But sometimes that's fine. You just want to visit a web page without other people knowing you're visiting that web page. You don't care if they see that someone accessed this web page. Your email, however, is a slightly different matter. Don't use plain text protocols that send usernames and email addresses. You're not very anonymous if people know your email address and name. But strangely enough, people at that embassy were doing it. The next type of attack I'm going to talk about is DNS leaks and other protocol leaks on the application layer. Does all the traffic you're trying to send actually go through the proxy, or does some of it leak out in other ways? DNS leaks are a classic example, and badly configured proxy settings could also lead to some types of traffic to go elsewhere, and I'll show some of those bad configurations here shortly. A snooper can set up web bugs, and if the protocol that the web bug is accessed via isn't properly supported by the darknet, it's possible they can find the real IP address of someone visiting a site. HTTPS is a good example of this, but plugins can also be an issue. There's a lot of plugins out there that don't necessarily properly respect the proxy settings of the browser that they're embedded in. Application level stuff is generally a problem. A whole lot of things in academia seem to revolve around traffic analysis attacks, but it takes a little bit more powerful adversary to pull some of those off. The application layer stuff, most people can pull off, I imagine, in this room. JavaScript is pretty much just hosed. Definitely use the Tor browser, Tor button.